The autumn of 1989 painted Millbrook College in brilliant shades of amber and crimson, the small liberal arts campus nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, looking like something from a postcard. The soccer team had just clinched their third consecutive conference championship, and the celebration at the old farmhouse on Maple Creek Road was in full swing. Jessica Hartwell and Amanda Torres, both juniors and star forwards, had been inseparable since freshman year. Jessica with her strawberry blonde hair and infectious laugh, Amanda with her quiet intensity and fierce loyalty to her teammates. The party that Friday night in October was supposed to be a milestone celebration, the kind of memory that would bind the team together for decades. Instead, it became the last time anyone would see Jessica and Amanda alive. Before we continue with this haunting story that gripped a small college town and left questions unanswered for over a decade, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. The farmhouse belonged to the Kellerman family, whose daughter Rachel was the team's goalkeeper. Set back from the main road by nearly half a mile, surrounded by dense woods and old stone walls that had marked property lines since the 1800s, it was the perfect place for college students to gather without disturbing neighbors. The party was supposed to wind down by midnight. Both Jessica and Amanda had early morning study sessions planned for Saturday, preparing for midterm exams that would determine their academic standing for the rest of the semester. According to witness statements collected by the Pennsylvania State Police, the evening progressed normally until around 11:30 p.m. The team had been celebrating with pizza, soft drinks, and a modest amount of beer that some of the older players had managed to acquire. Music played from a boombox in the living room, and conversations flowed easily between teammates who had spent countless hours together on practice fields and in dormitory common rooms. Jessica had been in high spirits, talking excitedly about the upcoming regional tournament and her plans to study abroad in England the following spring. Amanda, typically more reserved, had seemed relaxed and happy, even participating in an impromptu dance session that had several witnesses laughing at her usually serious demeanor letting loose. The first sign that something was amiss came when teammate Kelly Brennan realized she hadn't seen either girl for nearly an hour. Kelly, a senior defensive player who often took on a motherly role with the younger team members, began asking around the farmhouse. Rachel Kellerman remembered seeing both Jessica and Amanda near the kitchen around 10:45 p.m., engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with someone she couldn't clearly identify in the dim lighting. When pressed for more details years later, Rachel would describe feeling uneasy about the interaction, noting that both girls had seemed tense in a way that was uncharacteristic for such a celebratory evening. The search began informally, with teammates checking bedrooms, bathrooms, and even the old barn behind the house where some partygoers had been exploring earlier in the evening. Jessica's purse was found on a chair in the living room, her car keys still inside. Amanda's jacket hung on a hook by the front door. Their absence became increasingly alarming as the minutes ticked by, particularly because both girls were known for their responsibility and courtesy. They would never leave a party without saying goodbye to their hosts and closest friends. By 12:30 a.m., with no sign of either girl, despite extensive searching of the property and surrounding woods, Rachel's older brother David made the decision to call the police. The responding officer, Sergeant Robert McNeil, of the local county sheriff's department, initially treated the call as a routine matter involving college students who might have wandered off or decided to walk to another location. However, his attitude shifted quickly when he learned about the abandoned personal belongings and spoke with teammates who emphasized how out of character such behavior would be for both missing students. The initial search of the Kellerman property and surrounding area yielded few concrete clues. Flashlight beams swept through the woods, illuminating ancient oak trees and rocky outcroppings that had witnessed 2 centuries of local history. The creek that gave the road its name gurgled softly in the darkness, its banks muddy from recent October rains. Search dogs arrived before dawn on Saturday, their handlers working methodically through the forest and along the water's edge. The dogs picked up scent trails that seemed to lead toward the main road, but then disappeared abruptly, as if the girls had gotten into a vehicle. Campus security at Millbrook College launched their own investigation in coordination with local authorities. Jessica and Amanda's dormitory rooms were examined for any signs of distress or unusual activity in the days leading up to their disappearance. Their roommates, both visibly shaken by the situation, reported nothing unusual about either girl's behavior or mood. Jessica's roommate, a psychology major named Brenda Walsh, mentioned that Jessica had received several phone calls in the past week from someone she didn't recognize, but Jessica had dismissed them as wrong numbers or telemarketing calls. The college community, numbering fewer than 2,000 students, rallied around the search effort with remarkable intensity. Students organized volunteer search parties that combed through miles of surrounding countryside, while faculty members coordinated with local law enforcement to ensure that all leads were properly investigated. The campus newspaper ran daily updates on the search progress, and missing person flyers featuring photographs of both girls were posted throughout the small town of Millbrook and surrounding communities. As days turned into weeks without any trace of Jessica and Amanda, the investigation expanded to include state police resources and FBI consultation. The case attracted regional media attention, with television news crews setting up outside the college gates and interviewing anyone willing to speak about the missing students. Jessica's parents, a middle-class family from suburban Philadelphia, took leave from their jobs to coordinate search efforts and work closely with investigators. Amanda's mother, a single parent who had immigrated from Mexico and worked 2 jobs to support her daughter's education, struggled with language barriers, but remained steadfast in her determination to find answers. The autumn semester concluded with memorial services rather than celebration, as the soccer team and broader college community grappled with the unexplained absence of 2 beloved students. Winter snow covered the search areas, effectively suspending outdoor investigative efforts until spring. The case file grew thick with witness statements, search reports, and investigative leads that seemed to lead nowhere. Both families hired private investigators to supplement official efforts, but even these experienced professionals found themselves confronting a mystery that offered few concrete clues and fewer satisfactory explanations. Christmas break came and went with no developments, and when students returned for the spring semester, the atmosphere on campus remained heavy with unanswered questions. The soccer team struggled to regain their competitive edge, playing with a visible sense of loss that affected their performance throughout the remainder of the academic year. Jessica and Amanda's empty dormitory beds served as daily reminders of their absence, while their teammates graduated and moved on with lives forever marked by the mystery of that October night. Years passed, with occasional flurries of investigative activity, new witness interviews, re-examination of physical evidence, and periodic searches of areas suggested by psychics and amateur investigators. The case remained open, but gradually shifted from active investigation to cold case status. Jessica's parents established a scholarship fund in their daughter's name, while Amanda's mother returned to her demanding work schedule, carrying the weight of uncertainty about her daughter's fate. The farmhouse on Maple Creek Road was eventually sold to new owners who were unaware of its connection to the disappearance, and life in Millbrook slowly returned to normal rhythms marked by academic calendars and seasonal changes. The soccer program continued to honor both missing players with memorial plaques in the athletic building, and incoming freshmen learned about Jessica and Amanda during team orientation sessions that emphasized safety and the importance of staying together during social activities. Coach Margaret Thompson, who had recruited both girls and watched them develop into exceptional players and students, carried their memory with her through 2 decades of subsequent coaching, never quite recovering from the loss of 2 young women she had considered among her greatest success stories. By the late 1990s, the case had become part of local folklore, discussed in hushed tones by new generations of college students who heard fragments of the story during late-night dormitory conversations. Law enforcement files contained hundreds of pages of documentation, but no definitive answers about what had happened to Jessica Hartwell and Amanda Torres on that October night in 1989. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved, a cold case that would eventually be forgotten, except by family members and a few dedicated investigators who refused to abandon hope for resolution. However, in the spring of 2003, nearly 14 years after that fateful night, an unexpected phone call to the Pennsylvania State Police would finally break open the case and reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The caller was Diane Patterson, a former Millbrook College soccer player who had been present at the farmhouse party but had provided only minimal information during the original investigation. Her voice shaking with emotion and years of suppressed guilt, Diane told investigators that she was finally ready to reveal what she had witnessed that night. Information that would transform the case from a missing persons investigation into something far more sinister. Diane Patterson had been a sophomore midfielder in 1989, a player who struggled with confidence issues and often felt overshadowed by the team's more talented stars like Jessica and Amanda. In the years following the disappearance, she had moved across the country, earned a master's degree in social work, and built a successful career helping troubled youth in Los Angeles. However, the weight of her secret had followed her through every major life decision, affecting her relationships and undermining her sense of personal integrity in ways that finally became unbearable. The revelation came during what Diane later described as a spiritual crisis triggered by her work with missing children cases in California. She had been counseling the family of a runaway teenager when the parallels to Jessica and Amanda's case became overwhelming, forcing her to confront the moral implications of her long-held silence. The guilt that had accumulated over 14 years of carrying this secret had manifested in anxiety disorders, relationship difficulties, and a persistent sense that she was living a fundamentally dishonest life. Detective Michael Harrison, now a veteran investigator with the Pennsylvania State Police, took Diane's call on a quiet Tuesday morning in March 2003. He had worked the original case as a junior officer and had never forgotten the frustration of pursuing leads that seemed to evaporate upon closer examination. When Diane identified herself and mentioned the Millbrook College case, Harrison immediately transferred the call to a secure line and began taking detailed notes about what would prove to be the breakthrough that investigators had sought for over a decade. According to Diane's account, she had witnessed something that night that she had been too frightened and confused to report during the original investigation. Around 11 p.m., she had stepped outside the farmhouse to get some fresh air and clear her head after drinking more beer than she was accustomed to consuming. The October night was crisp and clear, with a nearly full moon providing enough light to see across the property toward the woods. She had been standing near Rachel Kellerman's father's pickup truck when she saw Jessica and Amanda walking toward the tree line with 2 individuals she initially assumed were fellow party-goers. However, as her eyes adjusted to the moonlight and the group moved closer to the woods, Diane realized that she didn't recognize the 2 people accompanying Jessica and Amanda. More troubling was the body language she observed. While not overtly threatening, There was something about the interaction that struck her as wrong. Jessica appeared to be gesturing animatedly, as if trying to explain or argue about something, while Amanda seemed more subdued, walking slightly behind the group in a way that suggested reluctance or uncertainty about their destination. Diane's alcohol-impaired judgment at the time had led her to assume that Jessica and Amanda were simply going for a walk with friends she hadn't met, perhaps other college students from a nearby campus or local residents who had somehow learned about the party. She had returned inside the farmhouse within a few minutes, rejoining conversations and activities that distracted her from further observation of the group's movements. It wasn't until the search began an hour later that she realized the potential significance of what she had witnessed. But by then, she was too frightened and confused to come forward with information that might implicate her in their disappearance. The fear that had kept Diane silent for 14 years was multifaceted and reflected the complex psychology of witness trauma. She had been underage at the time of the party, and terrified that reporting her observations would result in legal consequences related to underage drinking. More significantly, she had been plagued by self-doubt about the accuracy of her memories, wondering if alcohol had distorted her perceptions or if she was manufacturing false memories under the stress of the situation. The possibility that her information might send investigators in the wrong direction, potentially hampering efforts to find Jessica and Amanda, had paralyzed her with indecision. Additionally, Diane had been struggling with personal issues during her sophomore year that made her feel vulnerable and reluctant to draw attention to herself. She came from a conservative religious family that strongly disapproved of drinking and partying, and she feared that becoming involved in a criminal investigation would expose her activities to her parents and potentially jeopardize her financial support for college. The combination of legal fears, self-doubt, and family pressure had created a psychological trap that kept her silent even as she watched the investigation unfold and the families of the missing girls suffer through years of uncertainty. Detective Harrison spent over 3 hours on the phone with Diane during that initial conversation, carefully documenting her account while being sensitive to the emotional trauma she was experiencing in finally revealing her secret. He recognized that her information, while potentially crucial, was also complicated by the passage of time and the psychological factors that had influenced her original decision to remain silent. However, her description of the two unknown individuals and the direction they had taken provided the first concrete lead in the case since the initial investigation had stalled in late 1989. The detective immediately began cross-referencing Diane's account with the original witness statements, looking for any mention of unfamiliar individuals at the party or in the surrounding area. Most of the original witnesses had been college students who knew each other well and would likely have noticed strangers at what was essentially a private team celebration. However, the farmhouse's location on a rural road that connected several small communities meant that local residents might have learned about the party through various channels and decided to investigate or even crash the celebration. Harrison also initiated a review of criminal activity in the region during the fall of 1989, searching for patterns that might connect to Jessica and Amanda's disappearance. This analysis revealed several disturbing incidents that had occurred within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook College during the months surrounding the party. 2 other young women had been reported missing from a shopping mall in a neighboring county, though their cases had been classified as voluntary disappearances after evidence suggested they had left willingly with boyfriends their families hadn't known about. More troubling was a series of sexual assault cases that had been reported in rural areas, involving attackers who seemed to target isolated locations and young women who were alone or in small groups. The renewed investigation quickly expanded to include federal resources, as the potential interstate nature of the crimes and the passage of time required specialized expertise and technology that hadn't been available during the original investigation. FBI behavioral analysts began developing profiles of potential suspects based on Diane's description and the specific circumstances of the disappearance. The fact that Jessica and Amanda had been taken together suggested either multiple perpetrators or an individual with sufficient confidence and experience to control two athletic and intelligent young women simultaneously. Geographic analysis of the crime scene and surrounding area revealed several potential disposal sites within reasonable driving distance of the farmhouse. The region's topography included numerous abandoned mine shafts, dense forests, and remote waterways that could have been used to conceal evidence. Search teams with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs began systematic examination of these areas, while investigators worked to identify individuals who might have had knowledge of such locations in 1989. The psychological profile developed by FBI analysts suggested that the perpetrator or perpetrators likely had local knowledge of the area and might have been familiar with Millbrook College's social patterns. The timing of the crime, targeting a celebration when security would be relaxed and potential witnesses impaired by alcohol, indicated planning and observation that suggested the attack wasn't entirely random. This analysis led investigators to focus on individuals who might have had access to information about the soccer team's activities and the location of their celebration. Meanwhile, advances in forensic technology since 1989 allowed investigators to re-examine physical evidence that had been collected but not fully analyzed during the original investigation. DNA testing, which had been in its infancy at the time of the disappearance, could now provide definitive identification of biological evidence that might have been overlooked or considered inconclusive decades earlier. Air samples, fabric fibers, and other trace evidence were submitted to state crime laboratories for analysis using techniques that hadn't existed when the case was first investigated. The media attention surrounding the renewed investigation was intense, with national news outlets picking up the story of the decades-old cold case that had suddenly shown signs of resolution. Jessica's parents, now in their 60s and having never given up hope for answers about their daughter's fate, found themselves once again thrust into the public spotlight. Amanda's mother, who had remarried and started a new family while never forgetting her missing daughter, struggled with the emotional turmoil of having old wounds reopened while simultaneously feeling grateful that the case was finally receiving the attention it deserved. The investigation's renewed momentum created a ripple effect throughout the Millbrook College community, as former students and faculty members who had been present during the original investigation were re-interviewed about their memories of that time period. Some individuals who had been reluctant to speak with police in 1989 were now more willing to share information, having developed greater trust in law enforcement and understanding of the investigation process over the intervening years. Others found that the passage of time had actually clarified their memories, allowing them to recall details that had seemed insignificant at the time but might now prove crucial to solving the case. One particularly significant development came from Thomas Kellerman, Rachel's older brother, who had made the original call to police. During a re-interview, he remembered seeing a dark-colored van parked along Maple Creek Road earlier in the evening, positioned in a way that suggested the driver might have been observing the farmhouse from a distance. At the time, he had assumed it belonged to a neighbor or someone having car trouble, but in the context of Diane's revelation about Jessica and Amanda leaving with strangers, the vehicle took on much greater significance. Thomas's description of the van was remarkably detailed despite the passage of 14 years, suggesting that something about the vehicle had struck him as noteworthy even at the time. He recalled that it was an older model, possibly from the early to mid-1980s, with what appeared to be rust damage around the wheel wells. More importantly, he remembered that the van had remained in the same location for several hours, which seemed unusual for someone who was simply experiencing mechanical difficulties or making a brief stop along the rural road. This information prompted investigators to examine motor vehicle records from 1989, looking for registered owners of vans matching Thomas's description within a reasonable geographic area. The task was complicated by the age of the records and the general nature of the description, but advances in database technology allowed for more sophisticated searches than had been possible during the original investigation. The team also reached out to residents who had lived along Maple Creek Road in 1989, hoping to identify anyone who might have remembered seeing an unfamiliar vehicle in the area during the time period in question. The breakthrough that investigators had been seeking came from an unexpected source, a retired mechanic named Frank Morrison, who operated a small garage in a neighboring town. Morrison had seen the media coverage of the renewed investigation and contacted police to report that he might have information relevant to the case. In October 1989, a man had brought a dark blue van to his shop for emergency repairs, claiming that he had hit a deer while driving on rural roads late at night. However, Morrison had been suspicious of the damage pattern, which seemed inconsistent with a deer strike and more suggestive of impact with something harder and lower to the ground. Morrison's detailed records, which he had maintained meticulously throughout his 40-year career, showed that the van had been brought in on October 21, 1989, exactly 1 week after Jessica and Amanda's disappearance. The repairs had been extensive, involving bodywork, paint touch-ups, and replacement of damaged headlight assemblies. More significantly, Morrison remembered that the customer had paid in cash and seemed nervous throughout the interaction, repeatedly asking about the timeline for completing the work and whether Morrison would need to order parts that might create a paper trail. The customer had identified himself as Robert Chen and provided what Morrison later realized was likely a fake address and phone number. However, the mechanic's attention to detail had led him to make note of the van's license plate number and VIN, information that he had recorded in his service logbook as part of his standard procedure for insurance and warranty purposes. This information provided investigators with their first concrete lead to a potential suspect, setting in motion a complex investigation that would ultimately reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Motor vehicle records showed that the license plate Morrison had recorded belonged to a van registered to David Reginald Shaw, a 34-year-old maintenance worker who lived in a trailer park approximately 30 miles from Millbrook College. Shaw had no significant criminal record beyond minor traffic violations, but deeper investigation revealed a troubling pattern of behavior that raised immediate red flags for investigators. He had been employed in various maintenance and groundskeeping positions at several colleges and universities throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, often leaving these positions abruptly after short periods of employment. Background checks revealed that Shaw had been fired from a groundskeeping position at a small college near Pittsburgh in early 1989, just months before Jessica and Amanda's disappearance. The termination had been related to complaints from female students about his inappropriate behavior, including following women across campus and making unwanted comments about their appearance and activities. While these incidents hadn't risen to the level of criminal charges, they had been sufficient to end his employment and place him on an informal blacklist that prevented him from finding similar work at other educational institutions. Shaw's employment history showed a clear pattern of seeking positions that would give him access to college campuses and young women, often working night shifts or in locations that allowed him to observe student activities without supervision. His personnel files contained multiple complaints about boundary violations and inappropriate conduct, but the scattered nature of these incidents across different institutions had prevented anyone from recognizing the broader pattern of concerning behavior. The investigation into Shaw's background also revealed financial difficulties that might have motivated criminal activity. He had accumulated significant debt from gambling and had been evicted from multiple residences for non-payment of rent. In the months leading up to October 1989, he had been living in increasingly marginal circumstances, sleeping in his van or staying in cheap motels when he could afford them. This lifestyle had placed him in frequent contact with other individuals living on the margins of society, including several who had criminal records involving violence against women. When investigators attempted to locate Shaw for questioning, they discovered that he had died in a single-car accident in West Virginia in 1997, nearly 6 years after Jessica and Amanda's disappearance. The accident had occurred on a remote mountain road during a winter storm, and local authorities had classified it as weather-related after finding no evidence of foul play or mechanical failure. Shaw's van, the same vehicle that Morrison had repaired in 1989, had been destroyed in the crash and subsequent fire, eliminating a potentially crucial source of physical evidence. However, Shaw's death didn't end the investigation. Instead, it opened new avenues of inquiry that would ultimately lead to the truth about what had happened to Jessica and Amanda. Among Shaw's possessions recovered from the accident scene were personal items that suggested he had maintained some connection to the Millbrook College case over the years. These included newspaper clippings about the disappearance, photographs of the campus, and a notebook containing what appeared to be detailed observations about student activities and schedules. More disturbing were items that seemed to serve as trophies or mementos, including jewelry and personal effects that couldn't be immediately identified, but suggested Shaw might have been involved in other crimes against young women. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit determined that these items were consistent with the collections typically maintained by serial offenders who kept souvenirs from their victims as psychological reinforcement of their crimes. The investigation expanded to examine Shaw's activities and whereabouts during the time periods when other young women had disappeared or been assaulted in the region. This analysis revealed a troubling correlation between Shaw's employment history and unsolved cases involving college-age women across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. While not all of these cases could be definitively linked to Shaw, the pattern was sufficiently concerning to prompt a multi-state task force investigation into his potential involvement in numerous crimes. One of the most significant developments came from the analysis of Shaw's notebook, which contained detailed information about Millbrook College's soccer team, including player names, schedules, and social activities. This information had clearly been gathered through systematic observation over an extended period, suggesting that Shaw had been planning some form of attack against team members well before the October 1989 party. The notebook also contained references to other colleges and sports teams, indicating that his obsession extended beyond Millbrook and might have involved multiple potential targets. The revelation that Shaw had been systematically stalking the soccer team transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into recognition of a predatory crime that had been planned and executed with calculated precision. This understanding helped explain several aspects of Jessica and Amanda's disappearance that had puzzled investigators for years, including how the perpetrator had known about the party location and timing, and why the victims had apparently gone willingly with their abductor initially. Forensic analysis of the notebook's contents, cross-referenced with Shaw's known whereabouts and activities, painted a picture of an individual who had become increasingly obsessed with young college women and had developed sophisticated techniques for gaining their trust and isolating them from potential help. The fact that he had targeted two victims simultaneously suggested either tremendous confidence in his ability to control the situation or assistance from an accomplice who had never been identified. This possibility led investigators to examine Shaw's known associates during the relevant time period, focusing on individuals who might have shared his obsessions or been willing to participate in violent crimes. The investigation revealed that Shaw had maintained contact with several other men who had similar backgrounds involving inappropriate behavior toward women and difficulties maintaining stable employment. While most of these individuals had their own alibis for the night of the disappearance, the investigation uncovered evidence of a loose network of men who shared information about potential victims and locations where crimes could be committed with minimal risk of detection. The final breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Shaw's estranged brother Martin, who had been estranged from David for years, but contacted investigators after seeing media coverage of the renewed investigation. Martin revealed that David had visited him unexpectedly in late October 1989, appearing agitated and asking to borrow money for what he claimed was a necessary relocation to another state. During this visit, David had made several cryptic comments about having solved his problems and no longer needing to worry about certain issues that had been troubling him. More significantly, Martin remembered that David had been accompanied by another man during this visit, someone he introduced only as Ray, and who seemed equally nervous and eager to leave the area quickly. Martin's description of Ray matched the physical characteristics of Raymond Fletcher, a convicted sex offender who had been released from prison earlier in 1989 and had subsequently disappeared from his required check-ins with parole officers around the same time as Jessica and Amanda's disappearance. Fletcher's criminal history included multiple convictions for sexual assault and kidnapping, with a pattern of targeting young women in isolated locations. His disappearance from parole supervision had been investigated as a routine violation rather than being connected to any specific crimes, allowing him to remain at large for several years before being recaptured on unrelated charges in 1993. During his subsequent incarceration, Fletcher had made several statements to cellmates about crimes he had committed but never been charged with, including references to incidents involving college students that had occurred in Pennsylvania. The investigation team arranged to interview Fletcher, now serving a life sentence for subsequent crimes committed after his recapture. Initially resistant to discussing his past activities, Fletcher eventually agreed to provide information in exchange for certain considerations regarding his prison conditions. His account of the events of October 1989 finally provided investigators and the families of Jessica and Amanda with the answers they had sought for over 14 years, though the truth proved more disturbing than anyone had imagined. According to Fletcher's confession, he and Shaw had been planning to abduct college students for several months before the Millbrook party, having identified the soccer team as particularly attractive targets due to their regular social activities and predictable schedules. The October celebration had provided the perfect opportunity, as they knew the location would be isolated and the potential victims would be relaxed and possibly impaired by alcohol. Shaw's surveillance had provided detailed information about the team members' personalities and relationships, allowing them to identify Jessica and Amanda as victims who were close enough to each other that abducting them together would be feasible. The initial approach had been made under the pretense of being college students from a neighboring campus who had heard about the party and wanted to join the celebration. Jessica and Amanda, both friendly and welcoming by nature, had engaged in conversation with the two men without suspicion. When Shaw and Fletcher suggested moving the conversation outside, where it would be quieter and they could get to know each other better, Both women had agreed, seeing no reason to be concerned about what seemed like a normal social interaction. The transition from social interaction to abduction had occurred gradually, with Shaw and Fletcher guiding Jessica and Amanda toward the woods while maintaining casual conversation. Only when they reached the tree line, out of sight and earshot of the farmhouse, had the true nature of the situation become apparent. By then, the women were too far from help to alert others to their danger, and their abductors were prepared with restraints and weapons that made resistance futile. Fletcher's account of subsequent events was limited, as he claimed that he and Shaw had separated after leaving the immediate area, with Shaw taking primary responsibility for the victims, while Fletcher disposed of evidence and prepared their escape route. However, forensic evidence and behavioral analysis suggested that both men had been involved in the crimes that followed, which had culminated in the murders of both Jessica and Amanda at a remote location that Shaw had previously identified as suitable for his purposes. The location, Fletcher eventually revealed, was an abandoned mine shaft approximately 40 miles from Millbrook College, hidden deep in state forest land that Shaw had discovered during his various employment positions. The shaft had been sealed decades earlier, but Shaw had found a way to access it, recognizing its potential as a disposal site that was unlikely to be discovered by casual hikers or hunters. When investigators finally located the site in late 2003, they recovered remains that were positively identified as belonging to Jessica Hartwell and Amanda Torres, finally providing their families with the closure they had sought for 14 years. The forensic evidence recovered from the mine shaft confirmed the worst fears about what Jessica and Amanda had endured during their final hours. Both women had been sexually assaulted before being murdered, and the condition of their remains suggested that they had been kept alive for several days before their deaths. This evidence supported Fletcher's claims about Shaw's level of planning and preparation, as he had clearly prepared a location where he could hold victims for extended periods without risk of discovery. The investigation also revealed that Jessica and Amanda had not been Shaw's only victims. Evidence found at the mine shaft site included personal effects from at least 3 other young women who had disappeared from colleges throughout the region during the late 1980s and early 1990s. While Shaw's death had prevented prosecution for these additional crimes, the discoveries allowed investigators to provide closure to other families who had spent years wondering about the fate of their missing daughters. The revelation of Shaw and Fletcher's crimes sent shockwaves through the Millbrook College community and the broader region, as residents grappled with the reality that a serial predator had been operating in their area during a period when such dangers seemed like distant urban problems rather than local threats. The soccer team, many of whose former members were now adults with careers and families of their own, struggled to process the knowledge that their teammates had suffered such a terrible fate at the hands of individuals who had specifically targeted their team for victimization. For Jessica's parents and Amanda's mother, the end of the 14-year mystery brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. While they finally had answers about what had happened to their daughters, those answers confirmed their worst fears about the suffering Jessica and Amanda had endured. The knowledge that the perpetrators were both dead provided some sense of justice, but it could never restore the lives that had been stolen or heal the wounds that had affected so many people for so many years. The case ultimately led to significant changes in campus security policies and procedures at colleges throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The recognition that Shaw had been able to operate undetected for years while moving between different institutions prompted improvements in background check procedures and information sharing between educational institutions. Additionally, The case highlighted the importance of taking student reports of suspicious behavior seriously, as Shaw's pattern of inappropriate conduct had been documented but not adequately addressed by multiple employers. Detective Harrison, who had worked the case from its earliest days through to its final resolution, reflected on the complex emotions involved in finally solving a mystery that had defined much of his career. While he felt satisfaction at providing answers to families who had never given up hope, he also carried the weight of knowing how different things might have been if Diane Patterson had felt safe enough to come forward with her information in 1989. The case served as a reminder of how fear, shame, and societal pressures could prevent witnesses from providing crucial information that might save lives or prevent additional crimes. The story of Jessica Hartwell and Amanda Torres became part of the broader national conversation about violence against women and the particular vulnerabilities faced by college students. Their memory was honored through scholarship funds, campus safety initiatives, and educational programs designed to help young people recognize and respond to potentially dangerous situations. While their lives had been tragically cut short, their legacy contributed to efforts that might prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The 14-year journey from disappearance to resolution demonstrated both the persistence required to solve complex criminal cases and the importance of never giving up hope that truth can ultimately prevail over secrecy and fear. For the families, friends, and community members who had never forgotten Jessica and Amanda, the final chapter of their story provided painful but necessary closure to a mystery that had haunted them for over a decade. Though justice came too late to save two bright young lives, it ensured that their killers' crimes would not remain hidden forever and that their memory would be honored with the truth they deserved.